The requirements were specific: single engine, BMW 003 turbojet, maximum weight of 4,400 pounds, top speed of 750 kilometers per hour at sea level, takeoff distance under 1,600 feet, 30 minutes of endurance, 2 cannons. The manufacturers were given 3 to 5 days to submit basic designs. 3 to 5 days, not months, days. On December 6, 1944, 89 days after the specification was issued, a prototype flew for the first time. That timeline is not a misprint. From the moment the Air Ministry issued the requirement to the moment a German test pilot lifted the resulting aircraft off the runway at Schwat Airfield near Vienna, 89 days had passed. 3 months. In aviation development terms, where modern fighter programs require a decade from specification to first flight, 89 days from requirement to prototype represents something that has essentially never been replicated before or since. The aircraft was the Heinkel He 162. The Air Ministry called it the Volksjäger, the People's Fighter. It was built primarily of wood. It was designed to be flown by teenagers with minimal training. It carried a jet engine mounted on top of the fuselage, a placement chosen because it simplified construction and protected the engine from ground debris on damaged runways, not because it was ideal. The first flight lasted 20 minutes until one of the wooden gear doors fell off, victim of a faulty glue bond. 3 days later, the second prototype disintegrated in the air when the leading edge of the wooden wings separated during a high-speed run, killing the test pilot. Despite these beginnings, production continued, and within months, the He 162 was in the hands of Luftwaffe pilots flying combat missions over northern Germany. This is the story of the aircraft that Germany built in 90 days, and of a specific aircraft, Werk Number 120015, that survived the war, flew in French markings afterward, and was found to carry something inside its landing gear bay that nobody expected: a name and address written in pencil by one of the workers who built it. To understand the He 162, you need to understand what Germany's situation was in September 1944. The strategic bombing campaign had been systematically destroying Germany's industrial capacity for 2 years. Aluminum, the primary material of modern aircraft construction, was critically short. The factories that produced it were being bombed. The transportation infrastructure that moved it was being bombed. The fuel that powered the aircraft that defended the factories was being consumed faster than the refineries that produced it could replace it. What Germany still had in quantity was wood and woodworkers, and the dispersed network of small furniture workshops, carpentry shops, and cabinet makers spread across the Reich that had the tools and the skills to work with wood, and that were not, individually, significant enough strategic targets to attract Allied bombing attention. The decision to build the He 162 primarily of wood was not an aesthetic choice or an engineering preference. It was a supply chain decision. The fuselage was metal. Aluminum and steel were used where structural demands required them. But the wings, the control surfaces, the nose section, and numerous structural components were wood and bonded with adhesives. This allowed production to be dispersed across hundreds of small workshops that could never have handled aluminum fabrication. The final assembly was to be at the Heinkel plant in Marienhe, the Junkers plant at Bernburg, and in the infamously brutal SS slave labor factory near Nordhausen in the Harz Mountains, known blandly as Mittelwerk, Central Works. The labor involved in building the He 162 at certain facilities was not voluntary. This is not a footnote. It is part of the aircraft's history, and it is part of what makes the pencil signature found decades later in Werk Number 120015 carry the weight it does. The pilot plan was equally revealing of how desperate Germany's situation had become. The He 162 was designed with the explicit intention that it would be flown by Hitler Youth, teenagers selected from glider training programs, given accelerated jet conversion training, and sent into combat with minimal hours on type. Post-war, Ernst Heinkel critiqued the unrealistic idea that Hitler Youth could defend Germany after brief training with DFS Stummel-Habicht gliders. The clipped-wing Habicht gliders were intended to replicate the He-162's handling characteristics: stiff, demanding, requiring precise inputs, so that young pilots could develop some muscle memory before encountering the real aircraft. It was not a realistic plan. It was a plan shaped by a regime that had run out of realistic options and was substituting ambition for resources. The experienced Luftwaffe pilots who actually flew the He-162 in combat were largely contemptuous of the Hitler Youth concept. Flying any jet fighter was something best left to the experts, not to mention something like the He-162, which had a number of severe problems requiring a deft hand on the controls. The gap between what the He-162 was designed to be and what it actually required to fly safely was, from the beginning, a fundamental tension that the program never resolved. The He-162 was fast, genuinely remarkably fast. Powered by a BMW 003E1 turbojet, developing 1,764 pounds of thrust, the aircraft could reach 840 kilometers per hour, approximately 522 miles per hour in level flight. This was faster than any Allied piston-engined fighter and comparable to the early jet aircraft that were entering service on all sides in the final year of the war. The Messerschmitt Me-262, Germany's other operational jet fighter, was faster in a straight line, but it was also much larger, much more complex, and much more demanding to produce and maintain. The He-162 was smaller than a Bf-109, lighter than anything with comparable speed, and designed from the beginning to be built and operated with degraded resources. The BMW 003 engine mounted above and behind the cockpit created a distinctive aesthetic. The aircraft looked almost toy-like, with its oversized engine nacelle sitting on top of its slender fuselage like something assembled from mismatched parts. But the configuration had real engineering logic. The high mounting kept the intake away from the ground, protecting the engine from foreign object ingestion on the damaged and debris-strewn airfields that were all Germany had left by 1945. The twin vertical tail surfaces, mounted at the ends of the horizontal stabilizer rather than on the fuselage centerline, cleared the jet exhaust and gave the aircraft adequate directional control without a massive single fin. Bailing out of an aircraft with a jet engine directly behind and above the cockpit was a different problem. The aircraft was to be fitted with a simple ejection seat, fired by an explosive cartridge, making the He-162 one of the first operational aircraft with a functional ejection seat. He was also the first pilot to use the ejection seat of the He-162 and survive when he had to bail out on April 20, 1945. But against these genuine capabilities, the He-162 carried structural problems that were inherent to its hurried development and compromised materials. The wooden wing structure was bonded with adhesives that, in some batches, proved unreliable. The second prototype had lost its wing leading edge in flight because the glue had failed. Production aircraft continued to show instances of adhesive failure. The glue used was not a single approved formulation applied consistently. It was whatever adhesive could be procured from the dispersed network of workshops and subcontractors producing components. Quality control over hundreds of dispersed production sites operating under bombing pressure and material shortages was not what aviation manufacturing required. In tight turns, parts tended to fly off and the aircraft would spin out of control. The BMW 003 engine was prone to flameouts. The fuel consumption was high and the internal fuel capacity was limited, giving the aircraft approximately 30 minutes of powered flight, barely enough for an interception sortie, let alone a sustained engagement. At least 2 of JG-1's pilots were killed making dead-stick landings after exhausting their fuel. And the tricycle landing gear, while modern in concept, was compact and fragile, another weight-saving compromise that created vulnerability on every landing. The He-162 was an aircraft that rewarded exceptional pilots and punished average ones. In the Luftwaffe of late 1944 and early 1945, exceptional pilots were exactly what Germany no longer had in sufficient numbers. Delivery commenced in January 1945. JG-1, Jagdgeschwader 1, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter units, was selected to convert to the HE-162 and bring it into operational service. The conversion process itself revealed the aircraft's demands. Pilots who had flown conventional piston fighters for years found the HE-162's jet engine responses unfamiliar, its handling and tight maneuvers unpredictable, and its fuel consumption unforgiving. Many more losses were caused by flying accidents as unfamiliar pilots attempted to master the jet. The first confirmed aerial victory by an HE-162 pilot occurred on April 19, 1945. On 19 April, the pilot of a British Royal Air Force fighter who had been captured by the Germans informed his interrogators that he had been shot down by a jet fighter, by the description clearly an HE-162. On the same day, the Heinkel and its pilot were lost as well, shot down by an RAF Hawker Tempest fighter while returning to base. The HE-162's first confirmed kill and its first confirmed combat loss occurred on the same day, April 19, 1945, 19 days before Germany surrendered. In the 3 weeks from April 13th to the end of the war, 13 aircraft and 10 pilots were lost, only 2 or 3 in combat. The majority of losses were accidents, structural failures, engine flameouts, landing gear collapse, fuel exhaustion. The aircraft that Germany had built to defend itself was killing its own pilots faster than the enemy was. On 3rd May, all JG-1 surviving HE-162s were restructured into 2 groups. All JG-1's aircraft were grounded on 5 May, when General Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg signed the surrender of all German armed forces in the Netherlands, Northwest Germany, and Denmark. On 6 May, when the British reached their airfields, JG-1 turned their HE-162s over to the Allies. Germany's People's Fighter had been in combat for less than 3 weeks. The British forces who reached Lech Airfield on May 6, 1945, found 27 HE-162s on the airfield. The aircraft were examined, photographed, and evaluated. The engineering community on all sides recognized immediately that the HE-162 represented something significant, not as a war-winning weapon, which it had clearly failed to be, but as a proof of concept, that a jet fighter of this performance could be designed, developed, and brought to production in 3 months using degraded materials in a country under constant aerial bombardment, told the aviation world something important about what jet technology could enable in the hands of an industry with adequate resources. Numerous aircraft were shipped to the US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union for further evaluation. 5 were turned over to the French in February 1946, 2 A1 versions and 3 A2 versions. Werk Number 120015 was among the 5 that went to France, and in French hands it flew. The A2s were flown with French markings from April 1947 to July 1948. Werk Number 120015 was painted in a single color of gray-beige and bore the number 2. It was flown for most of the tests, totaling nearly 14 hours on a total amount of 18 hours of flight tests, each flight lasting approximately 20 to 30 minutes. This enabled about 30 French Air Force pilots to get a glimpse of jet flying in the years immediately after the war. 30 French pilots flew 120015, an aircraft built in the final months of a collapsing regime designed to be Germany's last air defense, was giving French aviators their first experience of jet flight in the years immediately after the war. After the French flight test program ended, 120015 was transferred to the Musée de l'Air et de l'Espace near Paris, France's National Aviation Museum, where it eventually became part of the permanent collection. Decades passed. The Memorial Flight Association has been asked to restore the HE-162, number 120015, on behalf of the Musée de l'Air et de l'Espace. When the restoration team began working on 120015, they conducted the kind of systematic disassembly and inspection that major warbird restoration projects require. Opening panels, examining structural members, documenting the condition of every component that had been inaccessible during the aircraft's decades in museum storage. Inside the landing gear bay, a space that would have been sealed during normal operation, accessible only when the gear was extended for ground inspection, the restoration team found something written in pencil on the interior surface. A name, an address. The Memorial Flight Association noted, "We can read the name and address of a man who apparently worked on this aircraft." The pencil signature belonged to someone who had touched this specific aircraft during its construction in early 1945. A worker at the Heinkel factory, at one of the many subcontractors, in one of the dispersed workshops that contributed components to the Heinkel 162 program, had written their name and address inside the landing gear bay of work number 120015 before it was sealed. Why? The motivation behind this kind of inscription, found occasionally in historic aircraft from this period, varies. Sometimes it was a simple record of who had worked on a specific component, a quality control notation, in a system where formal paperwork was not always possible. Sometimes it was something more personal, a worker leaving evidence of their existence in an object that might outlast the chaos around them. Sometimes it was both. The Memorial Flight Association noted, "This is also a reminder, planes are not just beautiful pieces of engineering." The man whose name was found in the landing gear bay of 120015 built this aircraft in early 1945, when Germany was losing the war and when the conditions in which aircraft production was occurring ranged from difficult to inhumane, depending on the facility. He wrote his name and address in a space that would not be seen during the aircraft's operational life, and 80 years later, when a French restoration team opened that bay for the first time in decades, his name was still there. We would like to know more about this man or his family, as it is a fantastic part of the history of 120015. As of this recording, that search continues. Only 7 surviving Heinkel 162A Volksjäger examples can be found in museum collections in Europe and North America today. 7 aircraft, out of approximately 275 completed, scattered across museums in Germany, Britain, France, Canada, and the United States. The Heinkel 162 program had ordered 1,000 aircraft per month, rising to 4,000 per month. It built 275 before the war ended, of which perhaps 120 were delivered to operational units. Of those, 7 survive in any condition. What those 7 aircraft collectively represent is a documentation of one of the most compressed and consequential aviation development programs in history. An aircraft that went from specification to prototype in 90 days, that flew in combat for less than 3 weeks, that proved that jet fighters could be mass-produced under conditions of total industrial degradation, that demonstrated simultaneously the possibilities and the limitations of revolutionary technology deployed too late in a lost war. The Heinkel 162's influence on post-war aviation was real, but indirect. The jet engine configuration it pioneered, top-mounted, fuselage-backed with twin-tail fins clearing the exhaust, appeared in several post-war designs that studied captured German aviation technology. The ejection seat it carried became standard on every combat jet that followed. The demonstration that a functional jet fighter could be developed and produced in 3 months established a benchmark for emergency aviation programs that has never been forgotten by military planners. But 120015 represents something beyond the engineering. The pencil name in the landing gear bay is a reminder that the Heinkel 162 was not built by engineers and industrial processes alone. It was built by people, in specific places, under specific pressures, in a specific moment in history. That was simultaneously the final collapse of a regime and the first chapter of the jet age. The name in that bay belongs to someone who built a jet fighter in the winter and spring of 1945 and wrote their address inside it. Who they were and what became of them is the kind of question that warbird restoration occasionally makes it possible to ask, and sometimes, with enough persistence, possible to answer. The restoration of work number 120015 continues. The search for the name continues with it.